The Lighthouse on Pine Ridge. The envelope from Seashore Savings and Trust had been sitting on Wren Ashford's kitchen table for 11 days. She knew what was inside. She had known since the moment the mail carrier set it down without meeting her eyes, that particular kind of careful avoidance that people practiced around women in her situation. Around widows. Around women whose houses were slowly being reclaimed by institutions that had no memory of the life lived inside them. 60 days. That was what the letter would say. She had done the math already, the way she did everything now alone at the kitchen table after Junie was asleep with a cup of coffee gone cold beside her laptop and the sound of Pennsylvania wind pressing against the windows like something that wanted in. She didn't open it. Not that morning. Not yet. That morning she had a funeral to get to. Wren stood in the doorway of Junie's bedroom at 7:45, watching her 8-year-old daughter struggle with the buttons on a black dress. Small fingers. Careful, precise, the way Junie did everything with a seriousness that sometimes broke Wren's heart, because that seriousness had not always been there. It had arrived the same week Everett did not come home from the Dalton manufacturing plant 2 years ago, and it had never fully left. The dress was the one Junie had worn to her father's funeral. It fit differently now. The hem that had fallen to her knees then barely reached mid-thigh. The sleeves that had needed rolling now ended at exactly the right place. Junie had grown 2 inches in grief, 2 inches in the particular silence that settles over a house when the person who filled it most is suddenly permanently gone. "Is this the right one?" Junie asked, looking up. "For great-grandma Dot." Wren crossed the room and knelt in front of her daughter. She fixed the top button, the one Junie's fingers kept slipping on. She smoothed the collar. "It's perfect, sweetheart." Junie's blue eyes. Everett's eyes, the specific shade of pale gray blue that had made Wren fall in love with him in the parking lot of a hardware store 11 years ago, searched her mother's face with that old soul precision that had no business being in an 8-year-old. "Is great-grandma Dot going to be gone forever like Dad?" The question landed the way those questions always did, quietly, without warning, like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward through everything. Wren pulled her daughter close. She breathed in the smell of strawberry shampoo and the faint sweetness of the lavender soap she'd ordered from a small shop in Vermont, because Junie had loved the smell of it, and Wren had decided sometime in the months after Everett died that she would say yes to every small, beautiful thing she still could. "Yes, honey, but just like with Dad, we keep her with us, right here." She pressed her palm gently against Junie's chest. "That's where people go when they love us. That's how they stay." Junie considered this with the gravity of a much older person. Then she nodded once, the way she did when she had decided to accept something, even if she didn't fully understand it. "Okay," she said. "I'm ready." The drive to Millhaven Memorial Gardens took them through the full length of Grover's Creek, a town that had never quite decided what it wanted to be. Small enough that everyone knew the Ashford name, or more precisely, knew the Hale name, which was the name that mattered in this particular corner of western Pennsylvania. The Hales had been here for 4 generations. They had money the way old families had money, quietly, structurally woven into property and influence, and the particular confidence of people who had never had to wonder whether there would be enough. Everett Ashford had not been that kind of person. He had been a mechanic with good hands and a laugh that filled rooms, and an absolute inability to pretend he was impressed by things that didn't impress him. Wren had loved that about him, with a fierceness that still sometimes caught her off guard, the way she would be doing something ordinary, folding laundry or waiting for water to boil, and the love would come for him like a physical thing, followed immediately by the knowledge that it had nowhere to go anymore. The Hale family had tolerated Everett. That was the most accurate word. Dorothea had loved him genuinely in the quiet and certain way she loved things she recognized as true. But Warren and Sylvia Dorothea's son and daughter, Wren's great-uncle and great-aunt, by the family's loose reckoning, had merely tolerated him. And when he died, their tolerance had shifted into a pity that was somehow worse. The kind of pity that comes with the unspoken implication that things might have gone differently if better choices had been made. Wren had stopped attending family dinners 8 months after the funeral. It had felt like removing a splinter, painful for a moment, then an enormous relief. They arrived at the cemetery 15 minutes before the service. The November air carried the particular cold of Pennsylvania in late fall, not savage but persistent, the kind that works its way through fabric and settles in the joints. An overnight frost had silvered the grass. Ancient oaks cast long shadows across the headstones, the last of their leaves letting go, in the slow spiraling way of things that have held on as long as they possibly can. Wren saw Warren and Sylvia immediately. They were standing near the canopy erected over the freshly turned earth of Dorothea's plot, surrounded by a cluster of relatives Wren recognized mostly from photographs. Warren was in a charcoal overcoat that cost more than Wren's monthly mortgage payment. Sylvia wore a structured black jacket and the expression of a woman who had spent considerable time arranging her face into the correct combination of grief and composure. Warren noticed them first. He said something low to Sylvia, who glanced over and then quickly away. Wren kept walking. She caught fragments of conversation as they approached, the careful kind not quite whispered, calibrated to be audible without being technically said to someone's face. Warren's voice, low and satisfied, heard she hasn't even been out to see the property yet. Sylvia's murmur in response, something Wren didn't catch. Then Warren again, the words landing with the particular precision of things said for an audience, the lighthouse of all things. Mother always did have a sense of humor. Wren gripped Uni's hand a little tighter. Uni squeezed back, which meant she had heard too, and was choosing not to say anything about it, which was somehow the most adult thing Wren had witnessed in a very long time. The service was brief and impersonal in the way of services for very old women who have outlived most of the people who truly knew them. A pastor who had met Dorothea exactly twice spoke about eternal rest and God's mercy and the beauty of a life fully lived. Distant cousins dabbed at dry eyes. Someone's husband checked his phone twice during the reading. Wren stood at the edge of the gathering with Uni pressed against her side and thought about the Dorothea she had actually known. Not the woman being eulogized, the abstracted, soft-focus version assembled for public consumption, but the real one. The woman who knew the name of every bird she had ever seen and could identify them by call alone. The woman who smelled permanently of peppermint and old paper. The woman who had looked at Everett Ashford the very first time Wren brought him to Sunday dinner and said quietly to Wren afterward that one knows what matters. Don't let him go. She had not let him go. Life had taken him anyway. Dorothea at 92 had been the last person alive who had known Wren's grandmother and her grandmother's mother and the man who had built the family's strange and stubborn foothold in western Pennsylvania from nothing but iron will and the particular clarity of someone who has seen war and survived it. Wren had listened to those stories at Dorothea's kitchen table every Sunday for 10 years. She had drunk weak tea and eaten shortbread biscuits and heard about Edmund Hale, Dorothea's father, the way children hear myths. Something enormous and distant and true all at once. Now Dorothea was gone, and Wren was the only one left who had listened. The reading of the will took place at the offices of Whitmore and Associates on the second floor of Grover's Creek's oldest commercial building, a red brick structure from 1887 that smelled of furniture polish and the particular dustiness of documents kept for longer than most people lived. Harrison Whitmore himself conducted the reading, a thin, white-haired man with a gentle manner and glasses that he kept pushing back up his nose with one finger, a gesture so habitual it seemed to happen independently of his attention. The conference room held them all. Warren and Sylvia at the head of the table, their respective attorneys seated just behind them like chess pieces in reserve, a scattering of cousins and family associates along the sides. Wren and Uni at the far end, Uni with a small notebook and a set of colored pencils that Wren had brought specifically for this purpose, to give her daughter something to do with her hands so she wouldn't have to sit with the weight of the room pressing on her. Harrison Whitmore arranged his papers with methodical care and cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. I'll proceed directly. The estate of Dorothea Eleanor Hale is modest in the traditional sense but carries no debt, and her instructions are clear and specific. What followed was predictable in the way of these things. Warren received the antique jewelry collection from Dorothea's mother, a set of oil paintings that had hung in the Hale family home for 60 years, and a letter of personal correspondence. Sylvia received the 2011 Buick, the silver service that had been in the family since before the Second World War, in a cedar chest Wren had seen in Dorothea's bedroom, but never asked about. Various cousins and old friends received smaller items: a first edition book, a handmade quilt, a set of bone-handled kitchen knives that had apparently been the subject of quiet family desire for decades. Then Whitmore paused. He turned a page. He pushed his glasses up. To my great-granddaughter, Wren Calloway Ashford, I leave the following. The Hale property, located at 156 Pine Ridge Road, Grovers Creek, Pennsylvania, commonly known as the Hale Lighthouse, along with all contents therein, all structures on the property, and all associated land to the full extent recorded in deed. Transfer requires payment of $1 in all property taxes through the end of the current year, which have been paid in full. The room went still. Then Warren made a sound. It was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of someone who had expected a particular outcome so completely that its confirmation produced something almost like amusement, the private satisfaction of a man who has arranged a board game in his favor and is watching the other player discover it. The lighthouse, Sylvia said. Her voice was carefully neutral. Of course she did. Wren sat very still. She was aware of Junie looking up from her notebook. She was aware of Warren's attorney leaning close to say something in Warren's ear. She was aware of every person in the room recalibrating their understanding of what this moment meant, most of them arriving at some version of worthless. A crumbling property on an overgrown road. A strange old structure that no one had ever quite known what to do with. A consolation prize dressed up as inheritance. Sylvia caught Wren's eye across the table. For a fraction of a second, something moved across her face. Something complicated, neither pity nor satisfaction. Something older than either. Then she looked away. Whatever it was, she swallowed it along with everything else. Mrs. Ashford. Whitmore's voice was gentle. He slid a cream-colored envelope across the table toward her. Your great-grandmother asked that I give you this privately following the reading. She was specific about the timing. Wren picked it up with both hands. Her name was written on the front in Dorothea's handwriting, the elegant, slightly trembling script of a woman in her 90s who had once had perfect penmanship and refused to let age take it from her entirely. The envelope felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. Is there anything further? Warren's voice was smooth, professional, the voice of a man for whom impatience was a luxury he could afford to express. Some of us have prior commitments. Whitmore shook his head. That concludes the official reading. The room dispersed the way these rooms always do quickly, with the low-grade tension of people who have been politely containing themselves and are now free not to. Warren and his attorney moved together toward the door, already in conversation. Sylvia paused for a half-second near Wren's chair, and for a moment, Wren thought she was going to say something. But whatever it was, Sylvia swallowed it. She adjusted the strap of her handbag and walked out. No one offered condolences. Not for the grandmother they had all lost today. The real one, the peppermint and paper one, the one who knew the birds by their calls. In the car, with the heater running and Junie buckled in the passenger seat, Wren opened the envelope. One sheet of Dorothea's personal stationery. The handwriting more deliberate than usual, a letter composed carefully with something to say. My dearest Wren, the lighthouse is not what people think it is when they look at it from the outside. It never has been. Your great-great-grandfather, Edmund, understood that the most important things in this world are almost always hidden from people who aren't willing to go looking. The light on the tower still burns. I kept it burning for 76 years because Edmund asked me to, and because some promises don't have expiration dates. When you're ready, go inside the tower itself, not the house, the tower. Find the star on the stone inside on the 3rd level. The key will tell you the rest. Don't trust anyone with what you find until you understand the whole truth of it. Not family, not strangers. not anyone who comes asking before you've had time to know. I chose you, Wren, not because you were the only one left, because you were always the right one. All my love, Dot. Below the signature taped to the bottom of the page was an old iron key, heavy, hand-forged by the look of it, the bow shaped in a simple five-pointed star. Junie had been reading over her mother's shoulder. She touched the key with one finger, the way she touched things she considered important. "What's the star on the stone, Mom?" Wren read the letter again. Then she folded it, slid it back into the envelope, and set it in her lap. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think we need to go find out." They went the next morning. Wren had spent the night at the kitchen table with the foreclosure letter finally opened beside her laptop. A property search pulled up on the screen, and Dorothea's letter read four more times. The Hale property at 156 Pine Ridge Road, 15 acres total, with a primary structure and secondary outbuildings recorded. Property taxes paid through the current year. Assessed value modest. The listing notation in the county database was sparse to the point of oddness, as if whoever had entered it had decided some things didn't need full explanation. Tower structure, stone 5-story. Residential annex attached. Rural private road off Route 16, 5 stories. Wren hadn't known that. She had heard the lighthouse mentioned in Dorothea's stories the way you hear about places you assume you'll someday visit distantly, with the comfortable procrastination of someone who believes there will always be more time. There had not been more time. There was now only what Dorothea had left her, and whatever it meant. She packed the way a woman packs when she has learned not to assume things will go smoothly. Overnight bag for herself in uni flashlights. Cleaning supplies, the non-perishables from the back of the pantry, the emergency kit Everett had assembled 3 years ago, and which she had never had occasion to use. She packed the iron key in the inside pocket of her jacket where she could feel it against her ribs. Uni came downstairs in rain boots. It was not raining, carrying her stuffed rabbit and wearing the expression of someone who had decided this was an adventure and was committing to that interpretation. "Are we going to see the lighthouse? We're going to see what great-grandma Dot left us." "Is it actually a lighthouse, like with the spinning light?" "I think so." Uni considered this with the intensity she brought to things that required updating her understanding of the world. "But there's no ocean near here." "No," Wren said. "There isn't." Junie sat with that for a moment. Then, "That's really weird, Mom." "I know. I kind of love it." The drive took 40 minutes. State highway to county road to a narrow gravel track barely visible between two rows of old-growth pine, the trees pressing close enough that the branches scraped the roof of Wren's Subaru as she turned in. The morning was gray and cold, and still the sky the color of November in Pennsylvania that suggests snow is considering its options. Junie pressed her face against the passenger window, watching the forest move past. "This is like a fairy tale," she said. "The ones where the magic is hidden somewhere nobody thinks to look." The gravel road climbed for a quarter mile and then the trees opened. Wren stopped the car. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The Hale Lighthouse stood on the crest of the hill in the clearing ahead, and it was nothing like anything Wren had imagined. She had pictured something small and eccentric, a folly, maybe the project of an unusual man's unusual grief. She had not pictured this. The tower was white stone, or had been. Once age had worked it toward a pale gray cream, the color of old bone, in good light. 5 full stories cylindrical, perhaps 30 feet in diameter at the base, tapering slightly toward the iron-railed gallery that circled the lamp room at the top. The lamp room itself was glassed and the panes dark from the outside but intact. The tower had been built with care, not the rough care of improvisation, but the precise, patient care of a man who had decided this structure would stand for 100 years and had built accordingly. Along the tower's base, a single-story stone house extended outward, the residential annex the county database had mentioned. Low roof solid, its windows grimy but unbroken, its heavy wooden door facing the clearing. Above the door, lintel carved directly into the stone, 2 words and a date: Hale, 1898, which meant the land had been in the family since before Edmund, before the war. The original Hale who had claimed this hilltop had done so in the century before, and Edmund had simply been the one who built something on it that could be seen from miles away. On the iron gate that stood across the gravel path leading to the front door, someone Dorothea most likely, or Edmund himself, had tied a piece of faded blue ribbon. It moved in the morning wind, and above at the top of the tower in the gray November morning light the lamp pulsed. Slowly, regularly. A low rhythmic flash, barely visible in daylight, but unmistakable once you'd seen it. On, off. Not a malfunction, not a reflection. A deliberate operational light running on something, a battery system, a generator, some mechanism that had been maintained and was still somehow functioning. Junie's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Mom, why is there a lighthouse in the middle of the forest?" Wren looked at the tower, at the light pulsing at its top, at the carved date above the door at the old iron gate, and the faded ribbon moving in the wind at the stone house attached to the tower's base, like an afterthought, or like the real thing, the tower being the afterthought, the part that couldn't be explained by ordinary purposes. "I don't know yet," she said, "but Great-Grandma Dot said the light never stopped burning in 76 years. Junie looked up at the lamp, then back at her mother. "Someone has to keep the light on," she said. "Right, or it goes out." "Right. So who's been doing it?" Wren put the car in park. She picked up the iron key from the console where she'd set it when she got in. She felt its weight, the 5 points of the star worked into the bow. "Let's go find out." The iron key opened the gate. The gate opened to a flagstone path. The path led to the front door of the stone house, a heavy oak door, iron-banded with a lock that turned more easily than it had any right to given its age, as though it had been recently oiled, as though someone had known they were coming. Inside darkness, first, and then, as Wren's eyes adjusted, the shapes of a life kept in amber. The main room of the stone house was dominated by a fireplace large enough to stand in, built from the same pale stone as the tower. The furniture was old, a leather sofa worn to the softness of something that has been sat on 10,000 times, 2 armchairs flanking the fireplace, a dining table with 4 mismatched chairs. Everything was blanketed in dust, a soft gray layer that caught the light from the dirty windows and made the room feel simultaneously abandoned and preserved, like a place that had been waiting rather than dying. Wren found a light switch. Nothing happened. The main electricity was disconnected. She pulled a flashlight from her bag and swept the beam around the room. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace in neat rows, a collection of framed photographs. She crossed the room and studied them, the flashlight moving slowly from left to right. Edmund Hale as a young man, not in uniform here, but in work clothes, standing in front of the tower's stone base with a trowel in his hand, and the expression of someone in the middle of building something they intend to finish. Beside it, Edmund in uniform, the formal portrait style of World War II military photography, his face serious and young and already carrying something. Dorothea as a girl of maybe 8 or 9, standing on the front step of this very house, squinting against bright summer light. Dorothea and a man Wren didn't recognize, her husband James, who had died before Wren was old enough to remember him. And then, at the far right end of the row, a photograph that stopped Wren's breath for a moment. Wren and Everett, their wedding day. Standing in front of the small chapel in Millhaven, Everett's hand on the small of her back, both of them laughing at something just off camera. Wren had never seen this particular photograph before. It must have been taken by someone she'd forgotten to thank, and somehow, at some point, a copy had found its way to Dorothea, who had placed it here on this mantelpiece in this room that no one else had visited in years. Dorothea had been keeping them in the family story, even when the rest of the family hadn't. Junie had moved to the fireplace and was studying the photographs with that careful cataloging attention she brought to things. She touched the edge of Edmund's frame lightly. "Is this great-great-grandpa Edmund?" "Yes." "He built the lighthouse?" "Yes, after the war." Junie looked at the photograph for a long moment. He looks like someone who was thinking about something serious all the time. Wren looked at Edmund's face, the photograph of him in uniform, the youth, and the weight in it, simultaneously. I think he was, she said. I think that was the point. They spent the rest of the morning in the house opening windows, despite the cold, finding a generator in the shed behind the tower and getting it running after 3 attempts and 2 bruised knuckles. The refrigerator hummed back to life. The electric range sparked and lit. A landline in the kitchen turned out to be long disconnected and cell service was non-existent, this deep in the pines, which meant Wren's phone was useful only for its camera and its flashlight function. She discovered a spot in the upper clearing just beyond the gate where the elevation and the gap in the tree canopy occasionally allowed a weak signal. She would learn to use that spot strategically in the days ahead, making calls from it, the way you use a window on a cloudy day, quickly and gratefully when the condition presented itself. They found 2 bedrooms in the back of the house, the larger one with a full bed and a handmade quilt in deep greens and browns, the smaller one with 2 narrow beds under quilts in a pattern of stars and a bathroom that had been updated sometime in the 1990s, practical and plain. Evidence that Dorothea had kept the house functional through the years, even if she'd stopped coming regularly. A place maintained against the possibility of return. That afternoon, Wren made a fire in the main room and they ate sandwiches from the cooler she'd packed. And Uni drew in her notebook while the fire moved, and Wren read Dorothea's letter again, the parts about the tower. Find the star on the stone inside on the 3rd level. Can we look now? Junie asked without looking up from her drawing. For the star tomorrow, Wren said. Better light tomorrow. What do you think it does? Wren considered the iron key in her hand, the 5-pointed star of the bow catching the firelight. I think it opens something, she said. I think Great-Grandma Dot hid something important and she left us what we need to find it. Uni drew a star in her notebook. 5 careful points. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at the key. Like a treasure map, she said. Something like that, except real. Yes, Wren said. Exactly like that, except real. The night sounds of the forest came in through the walls, wind in the high branches, the occasional percussion of a dead limb settling. Wren banked the fire and put Junie to bed in the star quilt room and sat in the main room in the dark for a while. The iron key on the table in front of her, thinking about Edmund Hale, and what it meant to build a lighthouse where no ship would ever need one. He had come home from the war in 1945. That much Dorothea had told her. He had come home changed in the way that men came home from that particular war, carrying something that had no name in the language available to him. He had spent the next 3 years building a lighthouse on a hill in the Pennsylvania forest, 5 stories of pale stone with a lamp at the top that he had lit and kept burning. He had begun collecting objects, coins, medals, documents, buttons, letters from people who had been where he had been, who had lost who he had lost, or who had simply been present at the places where history had broken open and spilled something irretrievable. He had done all of this without explaining himself very much. Dorothea had said that was the family trait, we do things, and then we let them speak for themselves, but Wren suspected it was something more specific than that. She suspected Edmund had understood that some things cannot be explained. They can only be preserved. She was almost asleep in the armchair when she heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside, slow, deliberate. Not the random pattern of an animal. The regular, careful weight of a person trying not to make noise and not quite succeeding. Wren came fully awake between one breath and the next. She didn't move immediately. She sat very still and listened. The footsteps circled the perimeter of the house. She tracked them by the crunch of gravel, giving way to the silence of the flagstone path, and then the crunch again. Someone making a circuit. Someone measuring something or checking something or looking for a way in. Then the sound changed, a metallic scraping at the window nearest the back of the house. Not the wind, not a branch. The specific sound of something being worked against a frame, a tool, a blade, a pry bar. Wren was out of the armchair with the fire poker in her hand before she had consciously decided to move. She crossed the room to the hallway, checked Uni's door closed, the faint sound of her daughter's even breathing from inside, and then moved to the kitchen window, pressing herself to the wall beside it, and angling to see out without being visible from outside. Nothing in her line of sight but the dark yard and the shadow of the generator shed and the pale stone of the tower rising into the night sky, the lamp pulsing at the top with its slow, patient rhythm. Then an engine, somewhere beyond the tree line. A car starting quiet restrained someone making an effort. The crunch of tires on the gravel track moving away. Then nothing. She waited 10 minutes without moving. Then she checked every window and door. All locked, all intact. Whatever prying had been attempted had not succeeded. She didn't sleep after that. She sat in the armchair with the fire poker across her knees and watched the lamp at the top of the lighthouse pulse in the darkness outside the window, on and off, the way it had apparently been doing for 76 years without stopping. She thought about Dorothea's letter. Don't trust anyone with what you find until you understand the whole truth of it. Not family, not strangers, not anyone who comes asking before you've had time to know. Someone had been here tonight. Someone who had known they were here. Someone who had come in the dark and tried the windows before deciding to retreat. Whatever Edmund Hale had hidden under this lighthouse, it was not a secret anymore. Not entirely. And that meant Wren had less time than she'd thought. Morning came clean and cold and full of birds. Junie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her socks and sleep-tangled hair, with the stuffed rabbit under one arm and the expression of someone who had slept deeply and well and was ready for whatever came next. Can we look for the star now? Wren had coffee on the camp stove she'd brought and granola bars on the table and the iron key in her hand. Yes, she said, we can look for the star now. The tower's entrance was a heavy iron door set into the base separate from the house, connected by a short stone passage, but distinctly its own space, its own threshold. Wren unlocked it with the iron key. The door swung inward without resistance on hinges that had been oiled recently, and the smell came out to meet them, stone and age, in something mineral and clean like the inside of a well. The interior of the tower was a single circular room at each level, connected by a wooden staircase that spiraled around the inner wall, the stairs tight and steep, the wood darkened by decades of use but solid beneath their feet. Small windows at each landing admitted wedges of morning light. At each level, the walls were plain stone except for small iron brackets where lanterns had once hung. On the second level, Wren noticed something she filed away for later along the inner wall, partially obscured by the dust and shadow of the staircase. A simple mechanical chairlift had been installed, a narrow seat on a track operated by a pull-cord system of elegant simplicity. Old clearly, but intact. Someone had built it for a purpose that would only become clear when the time came. Uni went up first, one hand on the inner railing, the other holding her rabbit, counting the levels aloud. 1, 2, 3. At the third level, she stopped. The landing here was slightly wider than the others, a small circular room with a single north-facing window that looked out over the forest toward a ridge maybe 2 miles distant. The view from up here was different from anything visible below. You could see the land, the lay of it, the way the ridge folded back on itself, and the valley sat between the hills like a cupped hand. But it was the wall that Uni was looking at. Set into the stone of the east wall between two of the iron bracket holders was a carved stone panel approximately 2 feet square. In its center, a 5-pointed star, the same star as the key's bow, the same proportions carved with care into the pale stone. Around the points of the star, small symbols Wren didn't immediately recognize, letters maybe, or numbers worn with time. Junie put her hand on the panel. The stone was cool under her palm. She knocked on it. The sound that came back was not the flat, solid thud of stone backed by more stone. It was different, hollow, with a faint resonance like knocking on a door rather than a wall. "Mom," Junie's voice was very quiet. "It sounds hollow." Wren was already moving toward it. She ran her fingers along the edges of the carved panel, pressing at intervals, feeling for movement or give. Nothing along the top. Nothing on the left side. On the right side, near the lower corner, her fingers found a slight irregularity, a seam barely wider than the mortar lines elsewhere, forming a small rectangle approximately the size of a matchbox. She pressed. The rectangle depressed slightly, and something inside the wall made a sound, a small mechanical click, the sound of a mechanism engaging after a very long time. And in the center of the carved star, a keyhole appeared. Not a hidden keyhole, revealed a keyhole that had been part of the carving all along, worked into the design so seamlessly that it was invisible until you knew what you were looking for. The lock was old brass green with age but intact. Wren pulled the iron key from her pocket. The star of the bow matched the star of the panel. The proportions were identical because they had been made to be identical, the key and the lock designed together probably by the same hands at the same time. She inserted the key. It seated without resistance. She turned it. One complete revolution. A sound from within the wall, not a click this time, but something larger, a sequence of mechanical movements, springs and counterweights, and the patient physics of a system designed to last. And then the stone panel shifted, not swinging outward, but rotating inward, a full section of wall, framed by the carved border, moving on an internal pivot point, with the smooth, deliberate motion of something engineered rather than improvised. Behind it, darkness, and the top of a staircase. Stone steps descending. The smell of enclosed space rising to meet them. Not damp, not rotten, but old and sealed. And mineral, the smell of air that has been kept. From somewhere below, the faintest suggestion of light, not much, barely a glow, but enough to tell Wren the space at the bottom was not entirely dark. Junie gripped the back of Wren's jacket with both hands. "It's not a lighthouse," she breathed. "It's a vault." Wren shone her flashlight down the steps. Stone walls. A packed earth floor, visible at the bottom, 8 or 9 feet below. And along the walls at the base, shelves. Cases, shapes covered in cloth, boxes labeled and stacked and arranged with the care of someone who had spent years getting the organization exactly right. She counted 11 steps in the beam of the flashlight. She put her foot on the first one. "Stay close," she said to Junie, "and hold the railing." "I'm not scared," Junie said in the voice of someone who is a little scared and has decided that doesn't matter. "I know," Wren said. "Neither am I." And she went down. The room at the bottom of the stairs was larger than the tower's footprint should have allowed, perhaps 15 feet square, with walls of cut stone that extended beyond the tower's base, carved into the hillside itself. The ceiling was low but not oppressive. The temperature was stable in the way of underground spaces, cool and even, and it was full. The battery-powered lantern sitting on a wooden crate near the stairs, recent, not Edmund's, maintained by someone, cast a warm light across the length of the room. Wren switched it on to its full brightness and stood still for a moment and simply looked. Shelves ran the length of 3 walls, floor to ceiling, built from the same heavy oak as the house furniture. On them, wooden boxes with fitted lids, each one labeled in careful handwriting. Glass-top display cases arranged at eye level, their contents visible through the panes. Rows of coins in protective holders. Medals on velvet backing, small artifacts arranged with museum precision. Cloth-wrapped bundles tied with string, each with a tag. Ledgers, a dozen of them, at least, on a dedicated shelf, their spines marked with years. At the far end of the room, against the stone wall, a desk. A heavy oak desk, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. On it, an inkwell. A lamp that ran on the battery system. And a stack of journals, bound in leather, the topmost one open to a page covered in careful masculine handwriting. In the stone of the north wall, almost hidden by the shelving unit that stood before it, Wren noticed a narrow door of old wood, dark with age, its hinges thick with rust. She moved closer, examining the frame. The door opened inward. She pressed her fingers against it gently. The wood was swollen with time and did not give, but she could feel from the hollow weight of its resistance that there was space beyond it. Not a wall, a passage. She filed this away carefully, the way she was learning to file things at Pine Ridge, not urgent, but not forgotten. Wren crossed the main room to the nearest display case and bent to look through the glass. Coins, American and foreign both. She recognized the profile of Mercury on the old dimes, the torch of the Standing Liberty Quarter. Others she didn't recognize: French francs, German marks, British florins, each one in its protective holder, each holder with a small handwritten tag. She leaned closer to read one of the tags. Frank, given by Baker in Con Normandy, July 1944. He had nothing else to give. I will not forget his face. She stood up slowly. She moved to the next case. Military medals on velvet. She recognized the shape of a Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, a cluster of ribbons, each one tagged. She read another: Silver Star Lieutenant, R. Dempsey D. Company, 29th Infantry, killed at St. Lo, August 9th, 1944. He sang to the men in the dark to keep their courage. No one who heard him ever forgot. Uni had gone still in the center of the room. She was turning in a slow circle, looking at everything. The rabbit hung from her hand, forgotten. "It's a museum," she said. "We have a museum under our lighthouse." Wren picked up the topmost journal from the desk and opened to the first page. The handwriting was different from the tags, older, the ink more faded, the letters more formal. A date at the top: September 14th, 1945. I begin this record on the day of my return to Pine Ridge. These objects are not trophies and they are not souvenirs. They are responsibilities. Each one belongs to someone who is no longer here to keep it. I am keeping it for them. When memory fails, and it will fail, it always does, these things will speak of what happened and who was there and what it cost. I did not survive Omaha Beach by luck. I survived because 3 men put their bodies between me and what was coming. I owe them more than I can pay. This is my attempt to pay it. Edmund G. Hale, September 1945. Wren read the passage 3 times. She was aware of Junie somewhere behind her, moving carefully between the shelves, reading tags with the methodical attention of a child who has learned that things matter more than they appear. She was aware of the room around her, the scope of it, the decades of intention. It represented the life's work of a man who had decided that forgetting was its own kind of violence and had spent 50 years building a counterargument. She was aware of the iron key in her pocket and the letter in the envelope inside her jacket, and Dorothea's handwriting: "I chose you, Wren. Not because you were the only one left, because you were always the right one." And she was aware slowly the way large things arrived not all at once, but in pieces of what she had been given. Not a property, not a collection, not even a secret, a responsibility. The same one Edmund had written about on the day he came home from the war, in the same careful handwriting that had labeled every coin and every medal in this room for the next 50 years. The same one Dorothea had carried for the 50 years after that. Now it was here. It was hers. "Mom," Junie said from across the room. Wren looked up. Junie was standing in front of the shelf at the far left wall, holding her flashlight up to illuminate something. A ledger opened to a page near the middle. Her expression was the one she wore when she had understood something important before she had the words to say it. "There are names in here," Junie said. "So many names, and stories next to every single one." "Yes," Wren said. "He wrote down everything so no one would forget." "Yes." Junie looked at her mother across the length of the underground room, across the rows of shelves and cases, and the 50 years of careful, stubborn, necessary work. "That's why it matters," she said. "That's why we can't let them take it." Wren closed Edmund's journal. She held it for a moment, the weight of it, the smooth leather of the cover worn by decades of handling, the corners softened by time. Outside above them, the lamp at the top of the lighthouse pulsed on and off with its slow, patient rhythm. The same as it had for 76 years. The same as Edmund had said it. Wren looked at her daughter. "No," she said quietly. "We can't." They spent the rest of that first day in the underground room, not cataloging, that would come later, but simply being present with it. Moving slowly, reading tags, opening ledgers to random pages, and reading Edmund's entries in his precise, unhurried handwriting, the accounts of objects acquired and the human histories attached to each one. The room had its own atmosphere, distinct from the house above, and the forest beyond, something still and serious, the quality of a place where important things had been done quietly over a long time. As the afternoon light began to fade and the temperature in the underground room dropped another few degrees, Wren gathered the journals from the desk and tucked Edmund's first ledger under her arm. They climbed back up through the stone panel, and Wren turned the iron key to seal it behind them, the mechanism engaging with the same satisfying sequence of sounds. She stood for a moment at the third-level window, looking out at the ridge to the north, the forest rolling away in shades of gray, brown, and evergreen under the low November sky. Somewhere out there, barely visible through the trees, the first Hale property on this land had stood before Edmund built the lighthouse. She could see the higher ground of the ridge and imagine the foundation of the original house, somewhere in the trees at the base of it, invisible from this angle, patient as everything else that had been waiting here for someone to arrive. That evening, Sylvia called. The call came through on the weak signal spot in the upper clearing where Wren had gone with her phone just before dinner to check for messages. Sylvia's number on the screen surprised her. Surprised her in the way that certain things surprise you, only after you realize how little you had expected them. She answered. "I heard you were out there," Sylvia said. Her voice was measured, doing something careful. "At the lighthouse." "Yes," Wren said. "Since yesterday. There are some family documents that belong to all of us. Historical papers, deeds, records. Richard Warren." She corrected herself quickly, and Wren noticed the slip, the old naming habit, thought we should collect them before they deteriorated further. I wondered if we might come by. Wren stood in the cold upper clearing and listened to the wind in the pines and thought about Dorothea's letter. Don't trust anyone with what you find until you understand the whole truth. I'll need time to go through what's here before anyone else comes in, she said, keeping her voice even. I'll be in touch when I'm ready. A pause. Something unsaid on the other end of the line. Then, of course, take your time. The careful voice again performing a reasonableness that might have been genuine or might have been theater. Wren couldn't tell yet. She walked back to the stone house under the pulsing lamp, thinking about the call and what it meant that Sylvia, not Warren, had been the one to make it. Warren came himself the following afternoon. He arrived in a black SUV, parking with the confidence of someone who has decided he is entitled to be wherever he has chosen to go. He stepped out in a jacket that was slightly too good for the weather and walked up the flagstone path with the expression of a man conducting a reasonable errand. Wren was on the front step before he reached the door. I need to look through Mother's desk, he said without preamble. Papers that belong to the family. I won't be long. There is no desk. The lie came out cleanly, surprising her with its ease. Just furniture and kitchen things. Nothing of any organizational value. Warren's eyes moved past her to the interior of the house, assessing. I think you may not have had time to look thoroughly. I've looked thoroughly enough. She held her ground on the step arms at her sides, meeting his eyes. This property was left to me, Warren. Until I've had time to understand what's here, no one else needs access. Something shifted in his face. Not anger, not yet, but the recalibration of a man who has encountered an obstacle where he expected open ground. He looked at her for a moment longer, then at the lighthouse tower, the lamp blinking its patient rhythm at the top. You've always been stubborn, he said. Just like Dot. I'll take that. He turned and walked back to his SUV, and as he pulled away, Wren noticed that he did not accelerate down the gravel road with anger. He drove out slowly, the way someone drives when they are already thinking about what comes next. That night, Wren lay awake for a long time, the iron key on the table beside the cold remains of her tea, Dorothea's letter open in her hands. August Fenn arrived the following morning in a rust-streaked blue pickup truck that looked like it had survived several winters more than it had any reasonable expectation of surviving. He was 71 years old, white-haired, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something more interesting than handsome, deep lines around the eyes, a jaw that suggested opinions held firmly, hands that moved with the particular economy of someone who had spent decades handling things that could not be replaced. He wore a canvas work jacket and carried a leather satchel that had seen considerable use, and when he stepped out of the truck and looked up at the lighthouse, his expression was not the expression of someone seeing it for the first time. It was the expression of someone coming back. Wren had found his number in the collection's 2017 appraisal document, a single sheet tucked between the pages of Edmund's 12th registry ledger. Professional letterhead, the kind of careful language that people who work with irreplaceable things learn to use. August Fenn Historical Artifact Appraisal and Conservation. The items reviewed represent a collection of significant historical depth. Conservative estimate of assessed value at time of appraisal, $2.3 million. This figure does not account for items not presented for review nor for appreciation since last full inventory. Recommend comprehensive reassessment. At the bottom in different handwriting, Dorothy as she recognized it now. August says full collection likely approaching 2.5, with undocumented pieces possibly higher. I told him I don't care about the number. He said he knows. That's why he keeps coming back. She had called him from the signal spot in the upper clearing. He had answered on the second ring, and when she said her name and explained who she was, there had been a silence on the line. Not the silence of someone surprised, but the silence of someone who had been waiting for a particular call and was taking a moment to acknowledge its arrival. I've been hoping someone would call, he had said. Dot told me someone would. Eventually. Now he stood on the flagstone path in front of the lighthouse and looked up at the lamp and then at Wren, and he extended his hand. She talked about you, he said, more than she talked about most people. She never told me about you, Wren said. No, she wouldn't have. Not until she was ready for you to know. He glanced past her toward the stone house. Is the collection intact? Most of it. I haven't done a full inventory. We found it 2 days ago. Something moved across August's face. Relief, she thought, mixed with something more complicated. Then we'd better start. They spent 4 hours in the underground room. August moved through it the way he had moved up the path, with the ease of someone who knew the geography without having to think about it. He had been here before, many times, most recently 6 months ago, to check the battery preservation systems that kept the temperature and humidity stable. That explained the recent lantern near the stairs. That explained the oiled hinges on the tower door and the gate and the chairlift on the second level that Wren had noticed. Dorothea had not been maintaining this place alone in her final years. August had been coming. Quietly, without announcement, the way people fulfill long obligations. He walked Wren through the collection with the patience of someone who understood that she was encountering 50 years of accumulated intention all at once, and needed time to absorb it rather than simply catalog it. The coins, first American and European, spanning nearly a century each one in its protective housing, with Edmund's handwritten tag detailing not just the object, but the human context of its acquisition. A 1916 standing Liberty Quarter in exceptional condition, obtained in trade from a veteran in Pittsburgh in 1952 who had carried it as a lucky piece through 2 wars and wanted it to be remembered properly. A collection of French centimes from the Normandy region, given piece by piece over 3 visits in 1948 by a farmer whose property had been the site of a firefight Edmund had survived, and the farmer had watched from a root cellar. Each one a transaction that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the specific gravity of shared experience. The military artifacts, next medals, insignia, uniform pieces, all documented with the same meticulous care. August paused at a case near the center of the room and stood for a moment without speaking. This section alone, he said quietly, would interest any military museum in the country. The documentation is what makes it extraordinary. Edmund didn't just collect the objects, he collected the stories that give the objects meaning. Without the stories, these are interesting historical artifacts. With them, there's something closer to testimony. How much? Wren asked. She heard the flatness in her own voice. The question felt crass, but practical reality could not be ignored indefinitely. August removed his glasses and polished them with the corner of his shirt. A gesture of calibration. She would come to understand the thing he did when he was arranging words carefully. Conservatively, he said, the entire collection approaches $3 million in current market conditions. Possibly higher if the undocumented pieces prove as significant as I suspect. He replaced his glasses. But I want to be clear about something. If you break it up and sell it in pieces, you'll get a fraction of that value and lose everything that makes it more than the sum of its parts. Edmund built something here that is greater than any individual item in it. The relationships between the pieces, the documentation, the through line of human connection, that's what gives this collection its real significance. Sell it whole to the right institution, and you're talking about a permanent legacy. Sell it apart, and it's just old things going to the highest bidder. Uni, who had been listening from her position on the wooden crate near the stairs where she had installed herself with her notebook and colored pencils, looked up. "So we're not selling it," she said. It was not quite a question. August looked at her with a particular respect he would come to show her consistently, the respect of someone who recognizes directness and values it regardless of the age of its source. "That's not my decision," he said. "That's your mother's." Junie looked at Wren. Wren thought about Edmund's words on the first page of his first ledger. These objects are not trophies and they are not souvenirs. They are responsibilities. She thought about what Dorothea had written. "I don't care about the number." "We're not selling it," Wren said. It was Sheriff Cord Mackey who told her about Warren. He arrived mid-afternoon in a county sheriff's department SUV parking behind August's truck in the clearing. And he was not what Wren had expected, late 50s salt and pepper, with the unhurried manner of someone who has been doing the same job long enough that urgency has become a choice rather than a reflex. He removed his hat when he stepped onto the flagstone path and held it in both hands, which Wren recognized as the gesture of a man who had learned to communicate respect through physical vocabulary. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "I'm glad you're here. I've been keeping an eye on this place for 20 years off and on. Your great-grandmother called me whenever she came out. Said she liked having someone official know she was around." "She never mentioned you either," Wren said. "She was careful about what she mentioned to who." He glanced at the lighthouse at the lamp pulsing at its top in the gray afternoon. "I heard about the reading of the will, and I heard Warren Hale has already filed paperwork." Wren was still for a moment. "How quickly?" "Same afternoon. His attorney filed a preliminary petition contesting the will on grounds of diminished mental capacity. He's claiming Dot wasn't competent to make estate decisions in her final year." Mackey turned his hat slowly in his hands. "That's the official version. The other version, the one I've been watching develop for 5 years, is a little more complicated." He pulled a folder from under his arm and set it on the hood of his SUV. Wren looked at what was inside. Property records, transaction histories, corporate registration documents for an entity called Ridgeview Land Partners, LLC, and a timeline assembled with the methodical care of a law enforcement officer who has been building a case quietly and patiently for longer than the subject is aware. Mackey walked her through it without editorializing, which made it worse. Somehow the flatness of the factual recitation giving the information a weight that outrage would have diluted. Warren Hale had approached Dorothea in the spring of 2019 with an appraiser of his own choosing, a man whose professional history included several instances of undervaluation in cases where the undervaluation had benefited the party who hired him. The appraisal had valued the Hale collection at approximately $900,000. Warren had offered Dorothea $750,000 for the collection and $300,000 for the property, a total of just over $1 million for something August Fenn had independently valued at more than twice that, and which the land alone would likely command in the current market. Dorothea had declined, firmly and apparently without much discussion. In the 18 months following her refusal, Warren had begun making inquiries to Dorothea's primary care physician, to a distant cousin who had once been her emergency contact, to the administrator of the senior center in Grover's Creek, where Dorothea had attended occasional events. The inquiries followed a pattern: concerns expressed about memory lapses, about fixation, about poor financial judgment. The language carefully calibrated to suggest cognitive decline without asserting it directly enough to be contradicted. Simultaneously, Ridgeview Land Partners, LLC, had begun acquiring parcels in the Pine Ridge area. Wren looked at the property map in the folder. The Hale property, the 15 acres including the lighthouse, and the surrounding woodland, sat at the top of the ridge, the highest point in the area, with a clear sight line in three directions. The parcels Warren had acquired or was in the process of acquiring surrounded it on three sides. A resort development, Mackey said. High-end, the kind that sells the view as much as the amenity. Without this property, the project is incomplete. The elevation, the sight lines, the acreage needed for the infrastructure. Ridgeview Land Partners has a development timeline. They're already behind it. Wren looked at the map for a long time. He didn't just want the collection, she said. The collection was a bonus. The land was always the primary objective. Mackey closed the folder. The will contest is a legal avenue, but Warren doesn't strike me as someone who only plays one angle. She thought about the footsteps on the gravel the night before Warren's first visit, the scraping at the window, the car starting in the distance and moving quietly away. Someone came here the night we arrived, she said. At night, tried the windows. Mackey's expression didn't change, but something in it settled the confirmation of a suspicion he had already held. I'd like to add some security to this property with your permission. Cameras, motion lights, and I'll increase patrols on Pine Ridge Road. Do it, Wren said. Whatever you need. She found the letter that evening. Junie had gone to bed early, exhausted in the clean way of children who have spent a day fully engaged with something that interests them. August had returned to his motel in town. Mackey had spent 2 hours installing motion-activated lights at the corners of the property and mounting a camera above the gate before leaving with a promise to return in the morning. Wren sat alone at Edmund's desk in the underground room with a second lantern and a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow, going through the stack of papers she had found in the desk's upper drawer. Not the secret compartment she had noticed the drawer's proportions suggesting, which would require a different key when the right moment arrived, but the ordinary working drawer which contained what appeared to be Dorothea's most recent working files. Receipts, notes, correspondence with August property tax documents. And at the bottom in an envelope she almost set aside without opening because it was addressed not to her, but to Everett. She picked it up. She turned it over. Everett Ashford on the front in Dorothea's handwriting. The envelope had been opened and then carefully resealed with a thin strip of tape, the tape slightly different in color from the envelope, the gesture of someone who had opened it for a reason and then preserved it for a different reader. She understood immediately that Dorothea had sealed it back up for her. The tape was the message. This was his, and now it is yours, and you should know. She opened it. The handwriting inside was Everett's. She knew it the way she knew his voice, the particular slant of his lowercase letters, the way he pressed harder on certain words without seeming to realize he was doing it the 3 dots he used instead of ellipses. His hands had held the pen that made these marks, and the knowledge of that physical fact moved through her with a force that had nothing to do with reason. Dear Dot, I don't know how to thank you for what you shared with me last Saturday. I've been thinking about it all week, not just the collection, but what you said about why Edmund built it, about what it means to refuse to let people disappear. I haven't told Wren yet. I want to wait for the right time. I want us to come out there together, her and me and Junie, and I want to show her what you've kept all these years. I think she'll understand it the way I understand it. Maybe better because she's the one with the Hale stubbornness, not me. We'll come in the summer, I promise. With real gratitude, Everett. At the top of the letter in pencil in Dorothea's hand, he came 4 times. He understood immediately. He would have been the right keeper. But Wren is the right one too. She just needs to find her way here herself. Wren set the letter down on the desk very carefully, the way you set things down when your hands are not entirely steady. He had been here. Everett had been in this room, had stood where she was standing, had held these ledgers, had read Edmund's words in his careful fading ink. He had told her he was going fishing. He had been keeping a secret that was also a gift, and he had not had the summer he'd promised Dot, and so the gift had waited 2 years to find its way to her. Arriving through a letter on the desk of a dead woman in an underground room beneath a lighthouse in the forest. She sat with it for a long time. The cold tea, the lantern light, the quiet of the underground room, which was the quietest place she had ever been. Then she folded the letter and put it back in its envelope and put the envelope in her jacket pocket next to Dorothea's letter, and she sat up straight and she took a breath. Summer had not come for Everett, but she was here now, and that was enough. Warren came the second time 3 days later, and this time he brought company. The company was a man in his late 40s in a charcoal suit that was slightly too formal for a gravel road in rural Pennsylvania, with the practiced ease of someone whose professional existence consisted primarily of making people feel that resistance was both futile and slightly embarrassing. He introduced himself as Jeffrey Strand, representing Ridgeview Land Partners. He had a firm handshake and the kind of smile that has been engineered to convey trustworthiness. Warren himself had adjusted his approach since the first visit. The forced pleasantness of before had been replaced with something more direct, not hostile yet, but honest, in the way of a man who has decided that pretense costs more than it's worth at this stage. "We'd like to have a conversation," Warren said. "A practical one." Wren stood on the front step of the stone house. She did not invite them in. "I'm listening." Strand did the talking, which was clearly the arrangement they had worked out in advance. The development project was described in terms that were clearly meant to sound appealing. Community investment, local employment, a destination that would bring revenue to a county that had been losing population for 20 years. The lighthouse itself, he noted, would be preserved as a feature of the resort, an amenity, a landmark, a selling point. Edmund's Lighthouse repackaged. "The collection is the complicating factor," Strand said. His voice was smoothly apologetic, as if the collection's complication were an unfortunate natural phenomenon rather than the direct result of Warren's choices. "We'd need it moved professionally, of course, full conservation standards, or liquidated. There are buyers for collections of this kind. We could facilitate introductions." "I'd like to make you an offer," Warren said when Strand had finished. He named a number. "For the property, for the collection separately, for the totality of what Dorothea had left Wren, reduced to a figure spoken in a gravel clearing on a November afternoon." The number was significant. It was more than Wren would earn in 10 years at the gift shop in Grover's Creek. It was enough to pay the mortgage, to pay Junie's education through college, to stop the particular grinding anxiety of a woman who checks her bank balance every morning before she gets out of bed, because the number determines what kind of day is possible. She was aware of all of this. She let herself be aware of it because pretending the awareness away would have been a form of dishonesty. And she had decided sometime in the last several days that the one thing she would not allow to happen in this situation was self-deception. She thought about Edmund's first entry. These objects are not trophies, and they are not souvenirs. They are responsibilities. She thought about Everett's letter. She'll understand it the way I understand it, maybe better. "No," she said. Warren's face did not change expression significantly, which told her this was not a surprise. "Wren, the collection stays here. The property stays in the family. Whatever legal challenge you filed, you'll have to see it through in court." She looked at him steadily. "I'm sorry this complicates your project. I don't think Edmund built this place to be an amenity." Strand began to say something about continuing the conversation, about keeping options open, about the practical difficulties of maintaining a property like this on a gift shop salary. Wren waited until he finished. Then she thanked them both for coming and went inside and closed the door. She stood in the main room for a moment. Her hands were steady. She had not expected them to be. The text messages started that afternoon. The first came from a number she didn't recognize, received at the signal spot in the upper clearing when she went up to check for messages, certain parties interested in the Hale collection. Discreet sale possible. 7 figures. No questions asked. Serious buyers only. She stared at it for a long moment. The second arrived while she was still looking at the first property alone, worth $500,000, to right developer. "Consider your options carefully. Situation may become difficult." She photographed both messages and called Mackie from the signal spot. He drove out within the hour, documented everything, told her the language of the second message was standard intimidation and not technically a threat, but that the timing was not coincidental and that she should save everything and change nothing. This is coordinated, he said. The will contest is a legal front. The texts are pressure from a different direction. Someone is trying to make you feel surrounded. Are they wrong? Wren asked. Mackie considered this with the honesty she had come to appreciate in him. No, he said, which means we need to move faster on the legal protections. He had already been in contact with an attorney, Priscilla Oakes, who practiced estate and historic preservation law in Pittsburgh and came with August's recommendation. Priscilla was driving out tomorrow. That night, Wren lay awake in the main room with the fire going low and the iron key on the table beside her and Dorothea's letter in her hand, read for what felt like the 100th time. The lamp at the top of the lighthouse pulsed outside the window. The forest pressed close and quiet. At 11:47, by the clock on the kitchen wall, the motion light above the gate blazed on. Wren was out of the bed she'd made on the sofa before the light had been on for 3 seconds. She went to the window without turning on any lights inside. Two shapes at the gate, one working at the lock with something metallic, the other standing back and watching the tree line. One of them was young, moving with the impatience of someone not accustomed to waiting. The gate clicked open. Wren went down the hallway to Junie's room. She put her hand on her daughter's shoulder and pressed gently once, and Junie came awake with the quick, alert wakefulness of a child who has already learned that nighttime interruptions are sometimes serious. "Someone's outside," Wren said, her voice barely moving the air between them. "We're going to be very quiet and go somewhere safe." Junie sat up. She looked at her mother in the dark with those pale blue eyes that saw more than they were supposed to. She nodded once, reached for the stuffed rabbit on the pillow beside her, and stood up without making a sound. Wren led her through the house to the stone passage connecting the main rooms to the tower entrance. She had the iron key in her hand. She unlocked the tower door and they slipped inside, and Wren relocked the door behind them. "Down," she said to Junie, quietly. They descended to the underground room. Wren lit the lantern at its lowest setting enough to see by without being visible through the narrow ventilation slits set high in the stone walls. From above, faint and muffled, the sound of movement in the stone house. The particular acoustic of a search drawer's open furniture shifted the irregular percussion of people looking systematically through spaces. They knew the layout of the house. They knew where to look, which confirmed what Mackie had suggested. Someone had been briefed. Someone with knowledge of the collection's location had told them where to begin. Junie sat against the far wall, her rabbit held against her chest. She was not shaking. She was watching her mother with the focused attention of someone who has decided that paying close attention is the appropriate response to a situation they cannot control. Wren crossed to the narrow door at the north wall. She examined it more carefully than she had before the frame. The hinges, the swollen fit of the wood, and the stone opening. The door opened inward. She pressed her shoulder against it and pushed steadily, applying even pressure rather than force. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something gave the compression of swollen wood finding its limit, and the door moved inward 6 inches, then 12, then enough to step through. Beyond, a passage. Not stone, but packed earth and timber shoring, older than the underground room, rougher, the construction of a different era. A tunnel narrow enough that Wren's shoulders nearly touched both sides, with crude wooden steps, where the floor descended, and low timber crossbeams she had to duck to clear. She understood immediately what this was. Edmund had served in an army that had dug tunnels in France under enemy positions. He had built his lighthouse on a hill in Pennsylvania with the instincts of a man who had learned that any fortified position worth holding needed more than one way out. This tunnel was not part of the lighthouse's design. It was older, possibly as old as the original stone house built in a different era of American anxiety. But Edmund had known it was there, and he had incorporated it into his thinking, and Dorothea had known, and now Wren knew. "Escape route," she said to Junie. "Your great-great-grandfather built a way out." Junie looked at the tunnel with the expression she reserved for things that confirmed her existing sense of how remarkable the world could be. "Like in the books," she said. "Exactly like in the books," Wren said. "Let's go." The tunnel ran approximately 50 feet on a descending grade before opening into a vertical shaft with iron rungs hammered into the earth wall. Wren went first, testing each rung before committing her weight, Uni following with the rabbit tucked inside her jacket for the climb. At the top of the shaft, a wooden hatch. Wren pressed upward, resistance, something heavy above. She shifted her grip and pressed again harder, and the obstruction moved with a scraping sound, and she pushed the hatch fully open, and cold night air came in from above. She emerged beside the base of an enormous white oak 200 years old, at least its roots spreading across the hillside in a network that had grown to incorporate and conceal the hatch cover, which was now effectively invisible beneath a carpet of dead leaves and the oak's exposed root system. She stood up in the night air and looked back toward the lighthouse. Through the trees 40 or 50 feet away, the stone house windows showed the moving light of handheld flashlights, two sources moving separately through the interior. They had found the tower entrance. She heard the sound of the tower door being worked, and then after a moment breached. They were going up. They would find the star panel. They had been told where to look. She helped Uni out of the hatch and lowered the cover back into place, fitting it under the root network as she had found it. Then she took her daughter's hand and they moved away from the lighthouse, deeper into the property, following the tree line north toward the high part of the ridge. They moved quietly. Uni did not stumble. She matched her mother's pace without complaint, holding the rabbit with one arm and her mother's hand with the other, her breath making small, visible clouds in the cold night air. After 10 minutes of walking, the lighthouse was no longer visible through the trees. Wren stopped. She knelt in front of her daughter. She looked at her daughter's face, at those blue eyes in the darkness, clear and present, and more composed than they had any right to be. "Are you okay?" "Yes," Junie said. "Are we going to the old foundation?" Wren blinked. "How do you know about the old foundation?" "I read about it in one of the ledgers. Edmund wrote about it. He called it the first house." Junie tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was recalling something precisely. "He said the first house was where it all began. The family, everything. The property records had mentioned a secondary structure ruins only on the north portion of the land near the ridge. She had not gone to find it yet. There had not been time. "Yes," Wren said. "That's where we're going." The ruins of the first Hale house were a quarter-mile north, where the land rose toward the ridge and the pines thinned into a more mixed wood of oak and ash. The foundation was visible even in the dark, the pale stone of the walls long since collapsed to knee height, forming a rough rectangle perhaps 20 by 30 feet in the leaf-covered earth. A chimney still stood at the north end, its upper portion fallen, but its base solid, the old brick pink-gray and unchanged. Wren had her flashlight now running on its lowest setting. She kept the beam aimed at the ground. The foundation was covered in decades of leaf accumulation and encroaching moss. She moved around its perimeter, looking for something to use as shelter from the wind while they waited for morning. The chimney base offered a partial windbreak on two sides. Uni had moved to the interior of the ruins, stepping over the low remnant walls, picking her way across the uneven ground. She was using her own small flashlight now, the backup one from Wren's bag, which she had insisted on carrying. "Mom." The tone of Uni's voice had changed. Wren crossed to her. Uni was standing near the center of the old foundation, her flashlight aimed at the ground. At her feet, barely visible under the leaf cover, a dull metal ring was visible iron attached to what appeared to be a slab of stone. Wren knelt and cleared the leaves away with her hands. The slab was concrete, poured, not quarried. The surface worked to resemble the natural fieldstone that formed the rest of the foundation. The work was good enough that it was invisible at any distance. Up close, the slightly different texture gave it away. Set into the concrete, the iron ring, and around the edges of the slab, sealed with what had once been tar and was now dried to brittleness, a fitted lid. Wren took hold of the iron ring. She pulled. The slab did not move on the first attempt or the second. On the third, with her full weight behind it, something gave the dried seal cracking, decades of compaction releasing, and the slab shifted. She and Uni worked together, finding purchase, rocking it back. It was heavy, perhaps 80 pounds, and it moved in increments. When they finally had it clear of the opening, both of them breathing hard in the cold air, they looked down. Stone steps, narrower than the underground room's stairs, going down perhaps 6 feet to a small chamber no larger than a generous closet with earth walls and a low stone ceiling. The smell that came up was different from the underground room. Older, less managed, the smell of something that had been sealed for a very long time. Wren went down first. The chamber was small enough that she could nearly touch both walls simultaneously. But what it contained, even in the limited flashlight beam, even half obscured by decades of settled dust, was clearly not nothing. A military footlocker. Steel olive drab stenciled in white paint that had yellowed but remained legible. Hail E.G., Private 116th Infantry 29th Division. The lock had rusted through. Wren lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them against the damp, a stack of notebooks bound together with a leather strap. A bundle of letters she could see even without reading them. The varied handwriting on the envelopes, some formal, some cramped, some looping, secured with a piece of cotton ribbon faded to almost colorless. And beneath these, folded in what had once been a uniform shirt, a leather case the size of a large book with a small brass clasp that came open with the pressure of one finger. Inside the leather case, in individual cloth pockets, objects arranged with the care of something precious. A purple heart, the ribbon preserved, a bronze star. Dog tags, she read the name Hail Edmund G. And beside them, a photograph, small and square, of a young woman in a summer dress, standing in front of the lighthouse, one hand shading her eyes, smiling. Vivian, Edmund's wife, his reason. And in the final pocket, wrapped separately in a square of cloth that had once been white, something small and round and dense. She unwrapped it carefully. A silver dollar. 1934. On one face, Lady Liberty in profile. On the other, the eagle and the inscription. And across the eagle's surface, a deep gouge, not age, not wear, but impact. The specific deformation of metal that has stopped something moving very fast. She turned it over. On the cloth, a slip of paper. Edmund's handwriting, the ink brown with time, carried over my heart, June 6th, 1944. Omaha Beach. I should have died on that sand. I don't know why I didn't. Every man I've kept in that room above us is why I keep going. They didn't get to. I have to for them. This was something different from the underground room. The underground room held the collection Edmund had built for the world, for history, for memory, for anyone who came looking with the right kind of attention. What was in this footlocker was what Edmund had kept for no one but himself, the record of his own survival, the confession of a man who had not been able to explain why he was alive when others were not, and who had buried that confession at the base of the first house and kept it there for decades, because some things could only be spoken to the earth. Wren sat on the earthen floor of the chamber her great-great-grandfather had built and dug by hand and sealed and left for someone who would understand it, and she held the silver dollar in both hands, and she was very still for a very long time. Junie's voice from above, soft and waiting. "Mom?" "I'm okay," Wren said. "Come down." Junie came down the steps carefully and stood beside her mother in the small earth room. Wren showed her the coin, showed her the note. Junie read it slowly, her lips moving slightly on the harder words. She looked at the coin. She looked at the gouge across its face. "He was almost gone," she said. "And then he wasn't." "Yes. And he spent the rest of his life remembering the ones who were." "Yes." Junie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the simplicity of a child who has arrived at something true, "That's why the light keeps going. It's not for ships. It's so they know he didn't forget." Wren looked at the coin in her palm. The lighthouse above them, in Edmund's underground room, and the miles of countryside around them in the November dark. And Warren and his timelines and his attorneys and his resort plans that would pave over all of this and call it an amenity. She closed her hand around the coin. "We're going to be okay," she said. It was not reassurance. It was decision. "I know," Junie said. She leaned against her mother's shoulder in the small earth room. "I knew that when we drove up and saw the light still going. Someone kept it going." Now it's us. They stayed in the chamber until the first gray light of dawn began to filter down through the open hatch above them. Then Wren carefully repacked Edmund's footlocker, lowered the lid, and helped Uni up the steps and back into the cold November morning. The birds had started. The forest around them was waking up in that incremental way of early light, one sound, then two, then the full accumulating chorus of a world that continues regardless of what happens within it. In the distance through the trees, the lighthouse stood quiet. No lights moved in the windows. Whoever had come in the night was gone. They walked back through the frost-stiffened grass toward the stone house, and as they came out of the tree line and the lighthouse came fully into view, Wren looked up at the lamp at its top, still pulsing, on and off, slow and steady and patient. She had made a promise to herself in the earth room at the first house, or perhaps Everett had made it first, and she was only keeping it now the way you keep a promise made by someone who loved you and could not be here to see it through. The light would keep going. Whatever came next, the attorneys in the courtrooms and the legal machinery Warren had assembled, the light would keep going. Edmund had ensured that in the mechanisms he had built and the instructions he had left. Wren intended to ensure it in the only way that finally mattered, by being here, by staying. Priscilla Oakes arrived at Pine Ridge the morning after the break-in, before the sheriff's department had finished processing the scene. She was 53 with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of posture that communicated she had not arrived to be managed. She drove herself in a slate-gray sedan, carried her own briefcase, and when she stepped out and looked at the lighthouse, she did what August Fenn had done. She looked at it not as something new, but as something she had been briefed on and was now confirming with her own eyes. August had called her from the signal spot in the upper clearing, while Wren and Uni were still in the earth room beneath the old foundation waiting for dawn. He had called Mackie as well. By the time Wren walked back through the tree line with Uni at her side and the cold silver dollar in her jacket pocket, 3 vehicles were parked in the clearing, and Mackie's deputies were documenting what the night had left behind. The underground room had been breached. The star panel stood open, the mechanisms still engaged. Inside, the methodical disorder of a search conducted by people who knew what they were looking for. Display cases forced, cloth-wrapped bundles, torn open boxes upended. The shelving along the east wall had been swept partially clear. What was missing, as August would establish over the next 2 hours, with his inventory and his measured, precise grief, were the items of highest immediate liquidity, the most complete and finest condition coin sets, 3 specific metals whose individual auction value was well documented in the collector community, and a packet of Civil War currency that Edmund had acquired in a trade in 1962 and cataloged as among his most significant American acquisitions. The thieves had a list. The list had come from someone who knew the collection specifically. Garrett Hale, Warren's nephew, was found at 7:40 in the morning, sitting in a pickup truck with a flat tire on the county road 3 miles from Pine Ridge. He was 22 years old and looked younger than that, and he had the expression of someone who had committed himself to a version of events that was already falling apart around him. Mackie handled the arrest himself. 2 deputies accompanied him. By the time Priscilla Oakes sat down with Wren at the dining table in the stone house, the table cleared of everything except 2 cups of coffee and a stack of documents. The situation had developed its own momentum, the kind that comes when enough pieces have fallen into place that the pattern becomes undeniable. The will contest is the primary front, Priscilla said. She had the manner of someone who covered a lot of ground efficiently and preferred to. Warren's petition claims Dorothea lacked mental capacity at the time of signing. We'll counter with a neurological evaluation that was completed in September of last year, 9 months before she died, by a specialist at UPMC who confirmed full cognitive function. The evaluation was thorough. Dorothea, it turns out, had anticipated this challenge. Wren thought about Dorothea in that doctor's office. 91 years old, peppermint and old paper submitting to neurological testing because she knew her own son well enough to understand what he would attempt. The foresight of it, the sadness of it. What about the theft? Wren asked. The theft helps us perversely. It establishes that the collection is at risk and supports an emergency petition for historical preservation status. I've been in contact with the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office. Given what August has documented, we have a strong case for designation. The collection scope, the documentation, the clear through line of historical significance going back to active World War II service. If we get preservation status even temporarily, it limits what anyone can do with the collection, regardless of how the will contest resolves. How quickly? The emergency petition can be filed today. Temporary status within a week if the reviewing officer agrees it meets the threshold. Priscilla set down her cup. There's a hearing scheduled for the will contest, next Thursday in county court. Warren's attorney will present their case. We'll present ours. The judge will determine whether there's sufficient basis to proceed with a full contest or whether the original will stand. Is there anything else I need to know? Priscilla looked at her steadily. Warren also has a connection to the county assessor's office. He's been making inquiries about whether the Hale property can be reclassified as commercially zoned land, which would significantly increase the tax burden. It's a pressure tactic, make the property financially difficult to maintain on your income, increase the incentive to sell. I've filed a countervailing assessment request that should delay any reclassification for at least 18 months. Wren sat with all of this. The scope of it, the legal fronts, the financial pressure, the theft, the text messages, the carefully constructed case Warren had been building for 5 years settled on her. Not with the weight of something crushing, but with the clarity of something fully revealed. She could see the whole shape of it now. And seeing the whole shape made it paradoxically less frightening. She knew what she was dealing with. That was better than not knowing. Tell me what to do, she said. Show up Thursday, Priscilla said. Tell the truth. Let us do the rest. The week between the arrest and the hearing had its own texture, the specific quality of time that passes when you are waiting for something important and cannot speed its arrival. Wren spent it in the underground room. She was methodical about it, the way Edmund had been methodical, the way Dorothea had been. She had a legal pad and a pen in the inventory system August had established over 15 years, and she worked through it shelf by shelf, case by case, cross-referencing what was present against August's records, confirming what was missing, photographing everything with her phone against the possibility that the original documentation was ever challenged. Junie helped. This had not been Wren's plan. Initially, she had imagined Junie occupying herself with books and drawing while the serious adult work was done nearby. But Junie had other ideas expressed with the quiet persistence that was her characteristic mode of getting what she wanted. I can read the tags, Junie said on the second day. You photograph, I read the tag out loud, you write it down, it's faster. It was faster, and it was something else as well. It was Junie learning the collection the same way August had described Dorothea learning it as a young woman at Edmund's side, object by object, story by story. The specific meaning of each item communicated through the act of saying it aloud, the names entering the room's air and becoming present in a way they had not been when they were only ink on a tag. Mercury dime, 1916D, fine condition. Given by Felix Hartmann, German-American Detroit, 1953. He served in the U.S. Army. His brother served in the Wehrmacht. They did not speak for 11 years after the war. This coin was his brother's. Felix wanted it kept somewhere that understood the weight of things. Junie read that one twice slowly. Then she looked up from the tag. Did they talk again, Felix and his brother? I don't know, Wren said. I hope they did. Me too. August came every day. He brought his conservation materials and worked on the damaged cases, assessing what could be repaired and what was simply gone. He was not sentimental about the losses, or rather his sentiment took the form of precision of documenting exactly what had been taken and why it mattered, building the record that would be needed when the stolen items began appearing on the market. He had already been in contact with other conservators and reputable collectors, putting out quiet notice through the channels that exist in the world of historical artifacts, the networks through which legitimate dealers communicate about items whose provenance is suddenly unclear. The stolen pieces would surface eventually. They almost always did. And when they did, the documentation August and Dorothea had maintained for 15 years would make them traceable. Edmund spent 50 years building a record so detailed that every object in this collection can be accounted for. August told Wren one afternoon, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose professional convictions have been vindicated. Warren's people took things they can't sell openly without that documentation. They've made themselves a problem. Mackey, for his part, had been building a different kind of record. He arrived at Pine Ridge every morning with updates that he delivered in the same unhurried, flat, factual manner he used for everything. Garrett Hale had been interviewed twice. His account had changed between the first and second sessions in ways that were revealing. He had not acted alone, and he had not identified targets independently. A list had been provided. Mackey did not yet have documentation connecting that list to Warren directly, but the chain of knowledge was short, and the links were becoming visible. "He's going to try to let Garrett take the full weight," Mackey said one morning over coffee in the Stonehouse kitchen. "That's his calculation sacrifice. The nephew maintained distance, preserve the legal strategy. Will it work?" Mackey turned his cup in his hands. "Garrett's 22 years old and looking at breaking and entering plus theft of items that will be valued in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. He has a calculation to make too." He looked at Wren. "People usually make the calculation that serves them best. We'll see which way he goes." On Wednesday afternoon, the day before the hearing, Roscoe Tanner arrived at Pine Ridge. Wren had not known he was coming. August had arranged it in the quiet way. August arranged things, making a phone call to a veterans organization in Virginia, explaining the situation and receiving in return the information that there was one surviving member of Edmund Hale's Unit D Company, 116th Infantry, 29th Division, living in a care facility in Charlottesville and in possession of his full faculties and a very clear memory. He was 94 years old, and he arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by a young man from the Veterans Transport Service. He had white hair cut close to the skull and a face that had been shaped by nearly a century of weather and experience into something that was less a face than a record. His hands on the arms of the wheelchair were large and spotted with age, the hands of a man who had once been very strong. When they brought him through the gate and he saw the lighthouse, he stopped. He looked at it for a long time, the lamp pulsing at the top in the afternoon light. "He really kept it going," Roscoe said. His voice was clear, deliberate, slightly rough at the edges in the way of very old voices. "All those years. He told me he would in a letter in 1948. I didn't entirely believe him." A pause. "I should have. Edmund Hale never said a thing he didn't mean." Wren crouched beside the wheelchair. "Mr. Tanner, I'm Wren. Dorothea was my great-grandmother." Roscoe looked at her. His eyes were sharp and pale and steady. "You have something of Edmund in the face," he said. "Around the jaw, the stubbornness." "So I've been told." He nodded as if this confirmed something. "All right, let's go see what he built." She brought him down to the underground room using the chair lift on the second level, the simple pull-cord mechanism that Edmund or Dorothea had installed at some point, specifically for exactly this kind of occasion, so that the room could be reached by anyone who needed to reach it, regardless of the stairs. Roscoe accepted this without comment, the way he accepted most things, as part of what had been prepared, the evidence of foresight rather than convenience. In the underground room, Roscoe moved through the space in his wheelchair with the slow deliberateness of someone reading in a language they have not used for a long time but have not forgotten. He stopped at certain items. He did not reach for them. He seemed to understand that reaching was not the point, but he looked at them with an intensity that communicated recognition. At the case containing the D Company medals, he stopped for a long time. "Dempsey's Silver Star," he said, reading the tag without picking it up. "I was there when they gave it to his wife. 1945. She couldn't stop shaking, not from grief, she'd already done her grieving, from pride. She was so proud of him, she couldn't contain it." A long pause. Edmund asked her if he could have it. Not buy it, not take it, asked her properly if he could have it, explained why, what he was building. She gave it to him on the spot, said she knew Richard would have wanted someone to remember. He moved on. He stopped again at a section of the shelving. Wren had not yet fully cataloged. Bundles of letters, dozens of them. Their contents described in Edmund's tag system only by the name of the sender and a one-line summary. "Those are the letters," Roscoe said. He collected them for years. Men in the unit would write to him after when they were back home, when things got hard, when they needed to tell someone what it had been like, because they couldn't tell their wives or their children. He wrote back, "Every one." A pause. "He told me once that the letters mattered as much as anything else, that the objects were anchors and the letters were the rest of it, the actual weight of what it meant to survive something that many men didn't." Uni was sitting on the wooden crate near the stairs, her notebook in her lap. She was not drawing, she was listening with the full stillness of someone who understands that they are in the presence of something that will not come again. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Roscoe turned his wheelchair toward her. "You can ask me anything you like, young lady." Why did he survive at Omaha? Roscoe was quiet for a moment. Then he said with the directness of someone who has had decades to decide what is worth saying and what is not. "I don't know, no one knows. That's the hardest part. The ones who died were not worse men than the ones who lived. They were the same men in most cases. Better, some of them. Edmund knew that. That's why he built all this." He gestured at the room around them. He couldn't explain why he lived and they didn't, so he spent the rest of his life making sure that the fact of their lives was not forgotten. The best tribute he knew how to give. Uni wrote something in her notebook. Wren looked over her daughter's shoulder. He couldn't explain it, so he built something instead. She thought that was perhaps the most accurate description of the collection she had heard. More accurate than any of the appraisals, or the legal designations, or the preservation petitions. Edmund Hale had not been able to justify his survival to himself, so he had built a 50-year argument for its worth. The county courthouse in Grover's Creek had been built in 1924 and had the architecture of an era that believed public buildings should communicate permanence. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, the smell of paper and central heating, and the stillness of a space where decisions are made that outlast the people making them. Wren and Priscilla arrived early. They sat at the respondents' table, the table of the party defending rather than challenging, and Wren arranged the documents Priscilla had prepared while Priscilla reviewed her notes for the last time. August sat in the gallery directly behind them. Mackie was there in his off-duty capacity, which was to say without his uniform, but with the quality of attention he brought to situations he considered significant. Warren and his attorney, a man named Kellerman, whom Wren was meeting for the first time, sat across the aisle. Warren had dressed for the occasion, charcoal suit, appropriate gravity. The presentation of a man with legitimate concerns rather than a man with financial motives. He was good at the presentation. She had to grant him that. Kellerman presented first. He called 3 witnesses over 90 minutes. A home health aide who had visited Dorothea twice a week in her final year testified that Dorothea sometimes confused the names of television programs and occasionally lost track of what day of the week it was. Under cross-examination, she acknowledged that Dorothea had been consistently clear about her financial affairs, her property, and her wishes for the collection. A financial advisor from Pittsburgh testified that Dorothea had declined several investment opportunities in her final 3 years that he considered prudent, preferring to keep her savings in low-yield accounts. Under cross-examination, he acknowledged that the alternatives he had recommended carried risk, that Dorothea had articulated her reasons for declining coherently and consistently, and that conservative financial management in one's 90s was not irrational. Warren himself took the stand. He spoke of concern for his mother's well-being, of conversations that had seemed disconnected, of his worry that she was becoming isolated. He was careful and measured and almost convincing until Priscilla asked him when he had last visited Dorothea at Pine Ridge. He said he could not recall precisely. Priscilla produced the visitor log that Mackie had discovered in Dorothea's papers, a simple composition notebook in which she had recorded with characteristic precision the date and purpose of every person who had come to Pine Ridge in the last 8 years. Warren's name appeared twice. The most recent entry was 4 years ago. Kellerman objected. The judge allowed it. Then Priscilla presented her case. The neurological evaluation first Dr. Sarah Whitaker of UPMC, whose findings were entered into the record and whose clinical language was unambiguous. Patient demonstrates full orientation to person, place, and time. Long-term and short-term memory intact within normal parameters for age. No evidence of cognitive impairment affecting judgment or decision-making capacity. August testified about the collection, its scope, its documentation, its historical significance, and Dorothea's consistent, detailed engagement with its management and preservation over the 15 years he had known her. He described their working sessions with specificity. He described Dorothea's reasoning about the collection's future with precision. He said simply and without drama that the woman he had worked with bore no resemblance to the woman being described in Warren's petition. Mackey testified about his 20-year professional relationship with Dorothea and about the property records and corporate documents he had assembled regarding Ridgeview Land Partners and Warren's acquisition activities in the Pine Ridge area. He stated his observations without characterization. He let the timeline speak. Then Roscoe Tanner was brought forward. He moved through the courtroom in his wheelchair with the unhurried dignity of someone for whom courtrooms are no more or less important than any other place. He was sworn in with the quiet attention of someone who has been taking oaths seriously his entire life. He did not speak about Warren. He did not speak about legal matters. He spoke about Edmund Hale, about D Company, 116th Infantry, about Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, about the men who died and the men who lived and what the difference between those two groups had meant to the ones in the second category. He spoke about Edmund's letters over the decades, about the collection he had described in those letters, about what he had understood Edmund to be building and why. He looked directly at the judge, a woman in her early 60s, silver hair pulled back, who had been listening with the quality of attention that very good judges develop for testimony that matters. Edmund Hale told me in a letter in 1962 that he hoped what he was building would outlast him the way the men it honored had outlasted everything else they'd endured. Roscoe said, "He told me he'd found the right person to carry it forward in his daughter Dorothea. He was right. I never met Dorothea Hale, but I know her from what her father said and from what's standing on that hill. A woman who kept that light burning for 76 years and documented every item in that collection with the same care her father used was not a woman suffering from diminished judgment. She was a woman honoring a promise." He looked at the judge. "There's nothing wrong with that judgment. It's the clearest kind." Wren testified last. She had been rehearsing what to say for days, drafting versions in her head while she cataloged the collection, while she lay awake in the stone house listening to the forest. She had imagined something structured and comprehensive. What came out when she sat in the witness chair was simpler than that. She talked about the Sundays at Dorothea's kitchen table, about the stories of Edmund that Dorothea told with the precision and vividness of someone recounting things she had witnessed, not merely heard, about the clarity with which an old woman recalled the important things, the texture of Edmund's voice, the way he held a coin when he showed it to someone, the names of men he had served with as naturally as she named her own children. She talked about the Lighthouse, about arriving and seeing it for the first time, the lamp pulsing in the November afternoon, inexplicable and somehow immediately right. About finding the letter Dorothea had written. About going down into the underground room and understanding for the first time what 50 years of careful intention looked like when it had been built by someone who understood what they were doing and why. She talked about Everett's letter, briefly without self-pity, because the courtroom was not the place for it. And because it was not a sad story, it was a story about a man who had understood something important and had tried to make sure it was preserved, and who had trusted the woman he loved to arrive at it in her own time. When Kellerman cross-examined her, he asked about her financial situation, about the mortgage, about the potential value of the collection and the property, and what that value could mean for someone in her circumstances. She said, "I'm aware of what it's worth. That awareness doesn't change what it is or what Dorothea asked me to do with it." He asked whether she had the resources to maintain a property of this kind on her current income. She said, "I'm working on that." He asked whether she had considered that her great-grandmother might have been placing an unfair burden on a young woman already dealing with significant personal hardship. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about Edmund's silver dollar in the earth room beneath the old foundation, about Junie reading the ledger tags aloud, object by object, name by name, about the lamp at the top of the lighthouse pulsing its slow rhythm through every night since 1948. Dorothea knew exactly what she was doing, she said. She knew it would be hard. She left me every tool I needed to do it anyway. That's not a burden, that's trust. The judge took a recess of 40 minutes. When she returned, she settled her papers and looked at the courtroom over her glasses with the unhurried authority of someone who has made her decision and is comfortable with it. The petitioner's case rests substantially on characterizations of Dorothea Hale's behavior as evidence of diminished capacity. Having heard the testimony in full, I find that these characterizations are inconsistent with the documentary and expert evidence presented by the respondent. The neurological evaluation is current, comprehensive, and unambiguous. The testimony of those who knew Dorothea Hale in a sustained professional and personal capacity describes a woman of consistent and clearly articulated values, not a woman whose judgment had failed her. She paused. She looked at the petitioner's table, at Warren, whose face had arranged itself into a careful neutrality. I find additionally that the evidence regarding Ridgeview Land Partners in the petitioner's acquisition activities in the Pine Ridge area is relevant context for evaluating the motivations behind this petition, even if it does not speak directly to the legal question of testamentary capacity. The court notes this context. Another pause, slightly longer. The petition to invalidate the will of Dorothea Eleanor Hale on grounds of diminished mental capacity is denied. The will stands as executed. The room moved the way rooms do after decisions, people gathering their things, conversations starting up in low voices, the general return to motion of people who have been holding still and waiting. Warren sat for a moment without moving. Then his attorney said something and he stood, and they moved toward the door, and as they passed the respondent's table, Warren stopped. He didn't look at Priscilla. He looked at Wren. "The appeal will take time," he said. "Months, probably. You'll be spending that time trying to maintain a property you can't afford. The development offer remains open." Wren looked at him. She thought about what Mackie had told her about Garrett's interviews about the chain of knowledge that was short and becoming shorter. She thought about what Priscilla had told her about the additional evidence that was now part of the public record. "The offer hasn't changed," she said. "Neither has my answer." Warren studied her for a moment. Something moved across his face, not rage, not contempt, but something more complicated. The expression of a man who has encountered something he does not have the tools to resolve. He turned and walked out. It was Sylvia who came to Pine Ridge 2 days later. Wren was on the porch of the stone house in the late afternoon, a cup of tea in her hands in the last of the November light cutting low through the pines when the car came down the gravel road. Not Warren's black SUV, a smaller car, dark green, moving with less urgency. Sylvia parked at the gate and came through on foot, which was different from every previous Hale arrival. She was carrying a large manila envelope and walking with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided to do something and is not giving themselves the opportunity to reconsider. Wren stayed on the porch. She waited. Sylvia climbed the flagstone path and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She looked at the stone house and the tower and the lamp pulsing at the top in the evening light, and her face did something complicated that resolved eventually into something simpler. "I grew up coming here summers," she said. "Did you know that Father would bring us out, Warren and me, every July for 2 weeks? Mother would cook on that old range in the kitchen. Edmund would let us follow him around the property." She looked at the lighthouse. "He took me down to the collection when I was 9. First time. He put a French franc in my hand and told me about the baker and Con. I held that coin for an hour." A pause. "I'd forgotten that. I forgot it somewhere along the way." Wren waited. Sylvia held out the manila envelope. "The land records for the north parcel, 10 acres from the ridge down to the property line. Edmund's land, it was deeded to me separately from the main property in Mother's final estate planning. I had the choice of what to do with it. Wren took the envelope. She opened it. Property deed properly executed, Sylvia's signature on the transfer page. Wren's name on the new ownership line. Warren doesn't know, Sylvia said. He will when it's recorded. He'll be angry. Will you be all right? Sylvia looked at her. The expression was measuring, not unkind. I've been afraid of Warren for 30 years. That's a long time to be afraid of someone who wants things that aren't his. She straightened slightly. I think it's time to stop. Wren looked at the deed in her hands. 15 acres had become 25. The ridgeland Edmund had looked out at from his lighthouse, the land Vivian had stood on in the photograph from the leather case, it was all one property now. There's something else, Sylvia said. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and produced a small folded paper. Garrett called me last night. He's cooperating with the sheriff fully. He told me to give you this, said he found it when he came into the collection room, and that he didn't take it, he left it. He wanted you to know. Wren unfolded the paper. It was a photocopy of an internal email from Ridgeview Land Partners, dated 8 months before Dorothea died, with Warren's name in the signature block. It discussed the timeline for the will contest in terms that assumed the contest had already been planned. It discussed the collection's liquidation in terms that assumed the outcome of a legal proceeding that had not yet occurred. She gave it to Priscilla that evening. Priscilla said nothing for a moment. Then she said there would be additional proceedings and that they would go well and that Wren should sleep. The next morning, Wren went alone to the underground room while Junie slept late after the exhausting days leading up to the hearing and through it. She sat at Edmund's desk in the early light and looked at the drawer she had been looking at since the second day. The ordinary upper drawer, the one she had already gone through, and beside it, the bottom drawer with its slightly inconsistent depth, its interior too shallow by perhaps 2 inches for the exterior measurement to account for. She had found the smaller key in Dorothea's sealed envelope the week before after Priscilla had confirmed the legal proceedings. The envelope had been the second one, not the letter delivered at the will reading, but a second envelope that Priscilla had been instructed to give Wren after the hearing's conclusion. Dorothea had left it with the firm in a sealed packet, instructions written on the outside, in her precise handwriting, to be given to Wren Calloway Ashford only after the matter of the will has been settled. Inside, a short letter and a small brass key. My dear Wren, if you are reading this, you have done what I knew you would do. The key opens the drawer that doesn't quite fit. Edmund kept his most private things there, not the collection, which was always for others, but the things that were only ever for himself. He showed them to no one his entire life. After he was gone, I looked once, understood what they were, and sealed them again. I told Everett about them because I thought he should know what kind of man Edmund was before he agreed to be his heir. He did agree. He understood immediately. These things belong to the keeper. That means they belong to you now. All my love. The smaller brass key seated in the lock of the hidden compartment cleanly. She turned it. The bottom panel of the drawer's interior released on a spring, swinging downward, to reveal a narrow space below perhaps 3 inches deep, running the full width of the drawer. Inside, a Purple Heart medal, the ribbon preserved in a velvet holder. Edmund's owned the one not in the footlocker under the old foundation, the one she had not known existed. Beside it, a folded square of cloth white, once now the ivory of very old linen, with a small monogram embroidered in faded blue thread. V.H. Vivian Hale. She unfolded it carefully. A dark stain covered much of the lower half, old and brown red. She refolded it gently and set it aside. And in the final space, in a small tin that had once held mints wrapped in a scrap of the same oilcloth from the footlocker, the silver dollar again. No, not the same one. Another one also, 1934, also piece dollar, but this one undamaged, its surface, worn smooth from decades of handling every detail of Lady Liberty's face, and the eagle's wings softened by touch. On its back, scratched with something sharp in Edmund's handwriting, so small she had to hold it to the lantern light to read it. For V, who waited, who never asked me why I couldn't sleep, who put her hand on my chest in the dark and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Wren held the coin for a long time. She thought about Edmund in the rooms above her head, in the house he had built for Vivian, in the tower he had lit for men who could no longer see any light. She thought about what it meant to be a person who carries the things they cannot put down and builds structures around them so the caring has somewhere to go. She thought about Everett. She thought about the summer they had never had. She thought about Uni asleep in the star quilt room, growing 2 inches a year, in all the directions that mattered, becoming a person who reads ledger tags aloud to herself in underground rooms and writes in her notebook that a man who couldn't explain something built something instead. She placed Vivian's coin back in the tin. She placed the tin and the metal and the folded cloth back in the hidden compartment. She turned the brass key to seal it, and she held both keys, iron and brass, one in each hand, feeling their different weights, the different tasks they had been built for. The keeper. That was the word Dorothea had used. Not the owner, not the heir, the keeper. She threaded both keys onto the chain she already wore around her neck alongside Edmund's locket, the one Uni had found in the first days and given to her without being asked, as if she had understood, without being told that this was where it belonged. 3 metal objects now on the single chain, the star-bowed iron key, the small brass key, the locket with Vivian's photograph inside. The accumulated weight of what had been kept and what still needed keeping. She went upstairs. 3 weeks after the hearing, the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office granted the Hale Collection permanent historical designation status. August was there the day the letter arrived. He read it standing in the underground room and then sat down on the wooden crate near the stairs, the same crate Junie had made into her cataloging station, and he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone receiving news they had hoped for long enough that its arrival feels unreal. Edmund would have considered this beside the point. He said, finally, he didn't build this for designation. He built it because it needed to exist. But the designation protects it, Wren said. Yes. He folded the letter carefully. That's what Edmund would have considered the point, not the honor, the protection. The designation meant the collection could not be broken apart or liquidated regardless of any future legal challenges. It meant Ridgeview Land Partners' plans for the property were effectively foreclosed. You cannot build a resort amenity around a legally protected historical site without the site's cooperation, and the site's cooperation was not available. It also meant resources grant programs, institutional partnerships, the network of preservation organizations that supported sites of this kind. Priscilla had already been in contact with the National Endowment for the Humanities. August had made calls to 3 university history departments. A professor of World War II history at the University of Pittsburgh had expressed interest in a formal research partnership that would bring graduate students to Pine Ridge and provide academic documentation for the collection's significance. The plan that took shape over those weeks was not dramatic. It was practical, which was perhaps the most appropriate tribute to Edmund's approach, a man who had done serious things quietly for 50 years. The Hale Lighthouse Heritage Center, open on weekends by appointment on weekdays, educational programs for regional schools, a partnership with a veterans organization in Pittsburgh to document oral histories connected to the collection's artifacts, a research residency for historians working on World War II memory and material culture, Wren as director, August as senior advisor, a part-time staff position already drawing applications because word had traveled the way word travels in the communities that care about these things, and people who cared about them wanted to be involved. The mortgage question resolved itself through a combination of the preservation grant and an arrangement with the University of Pittsburgh that included a small monthly stipend for Wren as the collection's primary steward. It was not wealth, it was sufficiency, the specific and underrated form of financial peace that comes when the gap between what you earn and what you owe closes to something manageable. Wren had been so far on the wrong side of that gap for so long that sufficiency felt in the early weeks of experiencing it almost vertiginous. She called the bank that held her mortgage from the signal spot in the upper clearing. The conversation was brief. The threat was ended. She sat in the cold upper clearing afterward with her phone in her lap and listened to the wind in the pines and felt something that took her a moment to identify. It was not happiness exactly. It was the absence of a fear, the chronic bone-level fear of a woman who checks her bank balance every morning before she gets out of bed because the number determines what kind of day is possible. That fear had been her companion for 2 years. Its absence was so unfamiliar, it felt like a sound she had been hearing for so long, she'd stopped hearing it, now suddenly gone. She walked back to Pine Ridge along the gravel road in the gathering dark. The lamp at the top of the lighthouse was already visible when she came around the last curve of the tree line, its patient pulse unchanged. On the last day of November, Roscoe Tanner called from Charlottesville. He had been thinking, he said, about the letters. Edmund's letters, the ones the unit members had written to Edmund over the decades, the ones Edmund had kept and cataloged, and which were now part of the designated collection. Roscoe had written letters to Edmund himself, many of them over the years. He had not known until recently that those letters were in the underground room at Pine Ridge. "I'd like to record what I remember," he said, "while I can, about the men in those letters, the ones I knew, the ones Edmund wrote about. I remember things about them that aren't in any official record anywhere." A pause. Edmund would have wanted those things written down. "I should have done it long ago." Wren said she would arrange a recording session. She said they would do it properly with a historian from the university present in the underground room, if Roscoe was willing, so that the recorded testimony would be formally connected to the artifacts it described. She told him she had already spoken to the World War II history professor in Pittsburgh, who was prepared to conduct the interview himself. Roscoe said that sounded right. He said Edmund would have approved of the care being taken. Then he said something that surprised her. "Tell that little girl, the one who asked me why he survived, tell her I've been thinking about her question. I don't have a better answer than I gave her, but I think she asked exactly the right question. Not many people do." Wren said she would tell her. After she hung up, she stood on the porch of the stone house in the cold last day of November air and looked up at the lamp. She had been thinking in those weeks about what the light meant, about Edmund's decision to build a lighthouse where no ship would ever need one to keep its lamp burning, for a reason that had nothing to do with navigation and everything to do with the human need to mark what has mattered and refuse to let it disappear. She had arrived here with 60 days until the bank took her house, and a sense of her life narrowed to the corridor of its immediate crises. She was leaving that Wren behind, not forgetting her, not dismissing the validity of what she had been carrying, but leaving her behind the way you leave behind the person you were before you understood something that changed the dimensions of your understanding. Edmund had survived Omaha Beach and spent the rest of his life asking why. And the answer he arrived at was not an answer, but an action. "I will remember them. I will build something that remembers them when I cannot. I will make the memory structural." Dorothea had carried that forward. For 76 years alone, with August's help, with the occasional visit of a young man named Everett Ashford, who had driven out on Saturday mornings and sat in the underground room reading ledgers and understood immediately what he was looking at. And now Wren. Not because she was the last option, because she was. Dorothea had been clear about this, and Roscoe had confirmed it in his own way, and Everett's letter had said it in the handwriting she knew better than her own, the right one. The one who would sit on the earth floor of a sealed chamber in the middle of the night, holding a silver dollar with a bullet gouge in it, and understand without being told what she was holding and what it asked of her. The evening they opened the Heritage Center for the first time, a soft opening, family and advisors only, before the public program began, the temperature had dropped to freezing, and the sky was the deep, clear black of a winter night without cloud cover, and the stars over Pine Ridge were extraordinary. August had set the underground room in careful order. The repaired cases were back in place. The shelving restored, the lanterns lit along the walls so that the space had the warmth of something that was meant to be seen. The remaining gaps where stolen items had been were marked with small paper cards, currently absent. Recovery efforts ongoing. 3 of the 6 missing items had already surfaced through August's network and were in the process of being legally reclaimed. The others would follow. Priscilla was there. Mackey was there. Dr. Whitaker, the UPMC neurologist who had evaluated Dorothea, had driven from Pittsburgh because August had invited her, and she had said she wanted to see what she had been protecting. She stood in front of Edmund's first ledger and read his opening entry with the expression of someone encountering something they had not expected. Roscoe Tanner's granddaughter had come on his behalf. He had not been well enough to travel that evening, but she brought word that the spring recording sessions were scheduled and that he had already begun writing down what he remembered so he wouldn't lose it before the historian arrived. She read a short letter from him aloud in the underground room. In it, he described the first time Edmund had written to him about the collection in 1952 and what Edmund had said he hoped it would become, not a museum, not a monument, but a room where the people who had been forgotten could be remembered by anyone willing to come and pay attention. That's what it is now. The letter ended. Edmund would be satisfied with that. He was not a man who needed more than that. Sylvia Hale came. She had not announced that she was coming. She simply arrived at the gate at 6 in the evening, alone in her dark green car. Wren let her in without comment. In the underground room, Sylvia moved slowly the way she had described moving through it as a 9-year-old girl following Edmund. She stopped at a case near the center of the room, the D Company medals, and she stood there for a long time without speaking. She found Wren later standing near Edmund's desk. "Mother was right," she said. "It was simply stated without performance. She was right about you. She was right about all of it." Wren thought of the photograph on the mantelpiece, Dorothea as a girl of 8 or 9, squinting against summer light on the front step of this house. 92 years old when she died, and she had spent the better part of those years here, or thinking about here, or writing letters to people who needed to understand what here meant. She had held this thing together through the entire span of her adult life alone, in the later years with only August's quiet assistance and the patient revolution of the lamp above. That was the true inheritance, not the collection, not the land, not the lighthouse. The willingness to hold something that mattered across the years it took to matter. "She left me everything I needed," Wren said. "I just had to find my way here." After everyone had gone, Wren and Uni sat on the front step of the stone house in the cold and looked up at the sky. Uni was wearing the silver locket she had found on the underground room shelving. In their first week, Dorothea's locket containing the small photograph of Edmund and Vivian on the day of their wedding. Edmund young and serious in his good suit, Vivian laughing at something just off camera. Uni had been wearing it every day since she found it. It suited her in a way Wren had not initially expected and had come to accept as simply true. Wren had the 3 objects on the chain around her neck. The iron key from Dorothea's first letter, heavy and star-shaped. The smaller brass key from Dorothea's second letter, meant to pass through Everett's hands on its way to hers, and Edmund's own locket. The one with Vivian's photograph inside, the one that had been Dorothea's to wear and was now Wren's, because the chain of keeping required someone to wear it. And Wren was that someone now. 3 objects, 3 generations of custody on a single chain, and a 4th beginning. She had thought sometimes in those weeks about what Everett would have made of all of this, of Pine Ridge, of the lighthouse, of the specific adventure of being his daughter's mother in a place like this. She thought he would have loved it unreservedly with the complete and uncomplicated love he brought to everything that was real and right and worth caring about. She thought he would have driven up this road and stepped out of the car and looked at the lighthouse and said something simple and true, the way he always said simple and true things when other people said complicated, unnecessary ones. She thought she was doing what he would have done, and that was not a consolation. It was a continuation. Above them at the top of the lighthouse, the lamp pulsed in the winter dark. "Mr. Tanner's granddaughter said he's going to come in the spring," Junie said, "for the recordings." "Yes. I want to be there for that." "You will be." Uni was quiet for a moment watching the lamp. Her breath made small, visible clouds in the freezing air. The stuffed rabbit was inside on her bed. She had stopped carrying it everywhere sometime in the last 2 weeks. Setting it down one morning without ceremony, the way children set things down, when they have moved past the need for them, without quite deciding to. Are we the keepers now, Mom? The lamp pulsed, on and then off and then on. Wren looked up at it, this improbable structure on an improbable hill, built by a man who could not explain his own survival, and so spent 50 years proving it had been worth it. She looked at the dark forest around them, and the ridge against the night sky, and the extraordinary winter stars above the lighthouse in the clear Pennsylvania dark. She felt the weight of the three keys on the chain, and beside her, she felt Junie's shoulder against her arm, and in her jacket pocket, she felt the edge of Edmund's silver dollar that she had carried there since the night in the earth room, the gouge in the metal familiar now under her thumb, the same way she imagined Edmund had worn smooth Vivian's coin with 50 years of handling. She put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "We always were, Eunie," she said. "We just needed to find our way here." The lamp pulsed overhead, on and then off, and then on again. The same rhythm Edmund had set in 1948, the same rhythm Dorothea had maintained through all the decades of her keeping, slow and steady, impatient broadcasting into the darkness over the ridge and the valley, in the silent winter forest, something that had no navigation use at all and was entirely necessary. Light continuing, memory held, the lamp pulsed, on,